Sorry. There was a kid talking, so I didn't want to walk out while he was talking.
That's fine. I've got your slides up. Do you mind looking at them real quick?
No. That's when we, yeah, that's actually see this one do that.
His laptop is showing up there, yeah.
So, if I play the slides, it doesn't matter. Krista has two of my slides, so I know if you don't, it's okay. I have them somewhere else.
Yeah, it would be nice to always get a note screen instead of
Do you know?
It's just
Oh yeah. He's gonna find a quiet spot.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you, Gretchen.
So we'll do, when you do your individual initial presentations, we'll sit on the front row when we have the panel or come to the front. Sure. So you're third. Oh, I see. After, pretty loud. Sure, I mean, it's recording, that's good. No question. Do you want to sit down?
I'll sit here.
Or talk about people, right? How you doing, sister? Think so. Yes. What's on what? Are you did you read it first? But did you read the chapter? Yeah. Oh, well, you know, it is nice right now in Oakland. Yeah. But this is the best time of year in the Bay Area. It's just like September, October, and then the rest is that. So you get snow here, right? Yeah, yeah. 25, 30 minutes. Yeah. Sometimes I just take BART and it's a little bit longer, but it's not far. Yeah, yeah. It's not easy to get to in San Francisco. It's not like easy to get to. So it's like back in the corner by Daly City and by the water, you know. So. Did you go to Cal? Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Where did you? Yeah. It's always, the grass is always greener, huh? What, where were you teaching? Or where were you? Okay. Yeah, I'm mostly familiar with Berkeley High.
Professor, I wonder if we could ask you to sit in front so that if laycomers show up, they can take the classes.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. could I start by suggesting that unless you have to leave early, could you move forward a bit? Because people are coming in late, and it's difficult if they can't find seats. So if you can move to a bit further forward, could you do so? Because that would be very helpful for anybody coming. We're expecting some people to come in late, so if just a few of you could move forward to leave some space at the back, that would be nice. Don't all move at once, but but certainly if you can make the back row available for people coming late, because it's if you wouldn't mind. Oh well, never mind. Okay, well, I'm Helen Haste, and I welcome you to this CMEI event, Civic and Moral Education Initiative. I'm convening it this year, and with the help of Julia, who's our coordinator. Wonderful. And this is the third event this semester. There'll be two more after this. And this is a slightly different from the previous versions. We've always had in the past colloquia, which have been primarily people speaking and having a comment from usually a doctoral student after the speaker has spoken. We're doing something slightly different. We're doing something called dialogues. We're trying to have sessions which are really designed to provoke discussion and well, I think on what we said on the poster, was it dissect, disturb, discuss? Dialogues aroused. This is the first dialogue, and I have to assure you that everybody who's speaking has pretty much on the same page. We're not going to have blood on the floor this time, at least, but they do have somewhat different perspectives. So we're hoping for a lively discussion. The format will be that the four speakers will speak for fairly briefly, occupying about the first 30 to 40 minutes. Then they will have a panel discussion, a bit like a TV chat show. And then in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll open it up for you to interact with them. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting and enjoyable afternoon. There is a sign-up sheet going around. Actually, there are several sign-up sheets going around. Please, could you sign up, even if you come before. We're not checking for your attendance. It's just that we hope very much that we can make sure that you're on our mailing list if you aren't already. If you are on a mailing list, it's nice to know who has actually come. So please make sure that you sign up on the sign-up sheet. So I'd now like to introduce and welcome our team today. I should say our primary speaker, but by no means the only speaker, is Sean Ginwright, who is well known for his work on marginalized communities. I will briefly read the bios of each of the people, but there are four people now. Sean, then there's, I think we'll ignore it, Cesar Cruz, who's a doctoral student here, Gretchen Brian Meisels, who's now on the faculty but was a doctoral student here, and Krista Goldstein-Cole, who is a doctoral student here. So just to read out their actually very exciting and extremely interesting bios. Can we close the door, perhaps? If there is a fire, we'll notice it and we'll go at some point. But, I don't think there is. Okay, Sean, his title, I see it goes off, you see, is the overall title, which is primarily based on Sean's ideas, is the Radically Healing Schools and Communities, Exploring Activism and Well-Being. And we really are delighted to welcome Sean. He's Associate Professor of Education in the Africana Studies Department and Senior Research Associate for the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy at San Francisco State University. From his forthcoming book, Soul Rebels, Ginwright's discussion is about hope and how community activists and youth development professionals are responding to the crisis of hopelessness among youth of color in urban America. Ginwright argues that educational improvement and political change will be the result of our ability to place healing at the center of our educational and political strategies. And this, in a sense, sets the agenda for the session this afternoon. In terms of Sean's bio, he's a leading national expert on African American youth activism, and youth development. He serves as a Senior Research Associate at the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy in San Francisco. He's also Professor of Education, as he said, in the Africana Studies Department. He's the author of Black Youth Rising, Activism and Radical Healing in Urban America, Black in School, Afrocentric Reform, Black Youth and the Promise of Hip-Hop Culture, and co-editor of Beyond Resistance, Youth Resistance and Community Change, New Democratic Possibilities of Practice and Policy for America's Youth. So he's a real international expert on those fields, widely recognized. The panelist, Cesar Chavez, is co-founder of Homies Empowerment. I think you can talk about that. He's a doctoral candidate on the EDLD program here. And he describes, from marching 76 miles to hunger striking for 26 days, Cesar has dedicated his life for justice. For 20 years, Cesar has been an educator overseeing the Homies Empowerment program, author of Revenge of the Illegal Alien, I love that, and Bang for Freedom. Currently, he's a doctoral candidate, as I said, in the education leadership. Gretchen Bryan-Meisels is a lecturer at HGSE in Prevention Science and Practice program. Her research seeks to explore holistic student support processes that build on the local knowledge of students and communities. She's particularly interested in finding ways to incorporate students in the researching and reforming of student support systems and school climate. And Krista Goldstein-Cole, doctoral candidate in human development education. Krista is an award-winning adult educator, former education director for the Washington State Family Policy Council. And Krista most recently served as Human Services and Corrections Policy Analyst for the Washington State Senate Democratic Caucus. Krista's research focuses on the role of schools in reducing the need for social services across the lifespan. So with that stellar collection of contributors to our panel, I welcome Sean to begin our afternoon.
Want to need that? Greetings. How's everyone? Good. It is an honor and a pleasure to share some ideas with you. For about 25 years, my work with African American youth in Oakland and San Francisco and really all over the country, I've developed a number of insights about the kind of issues that young people are dealing with. And in some ways, some schools are responding. In some ways, community-based organizations are responding. But I thought that it would be an exciting opportunity for me to share some ideas with you that's coming in my forthcoming book called Soul Rebels. And the book is really about understanding how we develop a sense of policy from our souls. And it really looks at the ways in which our society, our neighborhoods, our communities have eroded a sense of hope, not only among young people, but also among administrators and teachers. And so in Soul Rebels, I highlight groups around the country that are struggling, but also succeeding in building hope among teachers and among schools. And so I hope to share some of that with you, but I know I only have not that much time because we're going to talk about that in dialogue. I want to start with a quick story of the young man that I met 2 years ago in a program that sort of is brought together a group of African American young men who were in many ways hopeless. I met this young man. He called me one night. His name is Phil. Phil called me one night in February. And February in Oakland is not the same as February in Cambridge, but it's damn cold. And he called me. He said, "Man, I need your help." And I had only known Phil probably for about 2 months when he began the program. And I said, "What's up, Phil?" He said, "I need your help, man. I don't think I'm going to make it tonight." And I said, "What do you mean you're not going to make it?" He said, "I need your help. I need you to come and meet me at the community college where we had our healing circles." And so I went to meet him there. And he explained to me that when he left our healing circle group, this was the project that I had designed to build hope among young people, when he left the group, he actually didn't have a place to go. And he was actually sleeping near a BART station, in the BART station. And it was cold that night. He hadn't eaten. And so I was struggling with the decision whether or not or how I should help him, right? I didn't know whether I should actually just give him money for food, but what I decided to do was that we pulled up to a Motel 6. And I asked him to go ahead and check in, and we got him a room, and I got him some food. And from that moment on, Phil and I developed a profound sort of closeness in relationship. And that he began to actually, we began to have conversations not only about his own situation, but about the situation that him, his friend, and many other African-American young people in Oakland struggle with. And it was from that experience that I actually began to question, how is it that our schools, how is it that our public policy is actually addressing the brothers and sisters like Phil? No place to go, no food to eat, no sense of possibility and hope. And so it was with that struggling and with that wrestling about his sense of possibilities that I began to sort of think about how to lift up organizations and schools who are promoting a sense of hope among young people. Most of our research, most of what we know, most of what we document, most of what we even talk about when it comes to African American and Latino youth can fall in one of these three categories. I call it the PPP paradigm, 4 Ps. That is, researchers document the problems that African American youth face and navigate. That is, researchers look at programs around preventing young people from getting into problems such as drug abuse and substance abuse and early teen pregnancy and violence and so forth. And the last one is just pathology, right? That we look in the media and we can look in public policy that really views the lens by which we see African American youth and Latino youth is largely through a sense of pathology, which is they are problems to be fixed. And so in my own work, I also know that there's another lens that we don't talk enough about, and that's possibility. How is it that we can begin to understand the hopes, the dreams, the joy, the happiness, all of the things that make us human? Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're not human. So how can we begin to understand these things that young people bring to our schools and to our programs and build a robust public policy, a curriculum around that? And so in the book Black Youth Rising, I tried to document that struggle and that work in my own life in an organization that I created in Oakland called Leadership Excellence, where we work with African American youth to transform their lives so that they can become more profound activists and social change agents. And it wasn't a book about pathology. Even me and my friend Pedro Noguera, when he told me the name of his book, this is a little aside, his book is called The Problems with Black Boys. Have you seen that? So we debated, right? I said, Pedro, you need a more affirming title for your book, right? And so this title came from really wanting to have a much more affirmative, positive understanding about what it is young people actually bring to our schools and to our communities. And so I try to lift that up in this book. So when we talk about hope, when we talk about possibilities, what Phil, what his friends, what many African American young people deal with are threats to that sense of hope and possibility. Those threats are found in neighborhoods, and sometimes those threats are found in schools. But if we're not familiar with those threats, sometimes we misdiagnose what young people really need. So I want to take a few seconds to articulate in my work what I believe and what I've found the distinctions between a root cause and a symptom. And that oftentimes in our schools, in our community-based organizations, we might be we think we're addressing a root cause when really it's a symptom. And I think there are really 4 root causes that young people struggle with in our neighborhoods and communities. And I name these 4 root causes forms of trauma. Because they're named trauma because when we define trauma, trauma is something that disrupts our healthy and normal development and blocks our capacity to thrive. Something that disrupts our healthy and normal development and blocks our capacity to fully live and thrive. And so these are 4 that I found that African American and sometimes Latino youth as well struggle with. And the first is called historical trauma. Book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, makes the argument that when we really began to look at the roots of how the enslavement period damaged a sense of self and identity for African American young people, the kind of names, the kind of shame that young people have about their own racial identity is not simply from modern day technology and commercials, but it comes from a deeply rooted trauma that happened in the instance of slavery. So she documents the ways in which the names we use, the way that we talk about our skin tone, the shame that we bring to racialized moments. Right? All of these things are rooted in a historical trauma that if we're not aware of, we continue to reproduce. The second is environmental trauma. And I think James Garbarino, in his book, Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment, does the best job of identifying the ways in which our neighborhoods and our schools are in many ways toxic to the healthy development of young people. And he says that just like there are physical toxins in a neighborhood or community, you can look at, in your own apartment buildings, your own homes, there might be asbestos or lead paint. And just like if you're exposed to those physical toxins, over time, those physical toxins will make you ill. And if you don't get treatment from those physical toxins, ultimately they can become lethal. Well, he suggests that social toxins are in some ways more lethal than physical toxins. And social toxins are more lethal because they're invisible. You don't see them. And social toxins are things like shame and fear, insecurity, anxiety, stress. These are things that young people carry with them. In the stories that I've gathered in the new book, young people talk to me about what they feel like when they hear a siren coming, right? They tell me stories about what happens to them when they walk in a classroom and the teacher kicks them out and they get suspended because they had on a hat inside the classroom. They're suspended. They talk to me about what it's like going to school and walking through metal detectors. All of these things accumulate to environmental stress and trauma. And that if we're not aware of those, again, we sometimes reproduce that. The third is called acute trauma. And this is the trauma that oftentimes we're most familiar with. John Rich at Drexel University, who's actually a medical doctor, discovered that as he was doing research from young men who would come into the operating room with bullet wounds. And he said that, Sean, the first thing I realized is that the bullet wound wasn't the most severe thing that they've experienced, because they would sometimes, one time a young man came into the room and said, "I'll see you soon, doc," meaning that he was sure that he would come back. And it made John Rich wrestle with what are the kinds of what's going on with young people that they know that their lives are going to be consistently affected by trauma. And so in this book, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, he begins to look at the psychic spiritual wounds that young men bring into the operating room, right? And he suggests that it is not just the physical wounds, but it's the psycho-spiritual wounds that young people bring that actually make them more likely to be wounded again, right? And then the fourth is cumulative trauma. So all these things are not separate, right? That we have to look at all of these things, historical trauma, environmental trauma, acute trauma, and add all those up. And then ask the question, how does our education system deal with that? How does a teacher deal with that? And so a defiant student, a stressful school climate, is not a function of badass kids. It's a function of an accumulated trauma that they bring into the classroom that is not being addressed or simply misdiagnosed. Isaac Prelatinsky is a researcher. He was at the University of Miami. He suggests that that one way we can begin to think about healing these forms of accumulative trauma is through activism. And that activism provides, part of what trauma does is it says that you don't know what's going to happen next. You have a sense of anxiety because you don't have control over your life. And what activism does is it says that you can change something, and that there's a relationship between the ability for someone to act, their ability to hope, which facilitates a sense of well-being. So these conditions have created a toxic elixir of hopelessness and fatalism, which is the root cause of much of what we attempt to address in schools and programs. And I argue that youth development, civic engagement strategies designed to engage America's most disconnected youth will only be successful to the extent that they address hopelessness and create opportunities for young people to heal from these forms of trauma. So in my own work, the question is, then how do we make classrooms, community-based organizations, places for thriving for young people? And I shared this idea with a friend of mine she's no longer at the University of California, Berkeley. But I was giving this talk and sort of playing these ideas with her, and she was a biologist. And she said, that's an interesting idea, this idea of social toxins, because as a biologist, what we used to do is we're trying to understand how do plants thrive. And she said we would take these plants and we would put them into chambers. And they would pump those chambers with gas. And what we would do is measure how long it would take for the plant to die. And she said we would do that and we would measure time. But one time what we did is we took all the plants, we took the same plants, but we took a collection of them when we brought them together. But something happened when we brought the plants together. The plants actually began to pull out different nutrients out of the soil. And they began to metabolize different chemicals, and they began to emit a gas in the very chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas that they were pumping into it. They detoxified the toxic environment. And so I like to use that as a metaphor, right, to how we bring young people together in ways that detoxify neighborhoods, detoxify schools, and I call that process radical healing, a process that understands the structural barriers to hope, but also understands how we heal young people who've been exposed to trauma simultaneously. So in my work, we've tried to bridge these things together in a number of research projects. How is it that we facilitate radical healing with teachers and folks who work in communities? In the first project, back up a little bit. So in the book Soul Rebels, I've identified 5 principles of radical healing. And these are principles that are practiced, they are strategies, they are conscious efforts among organizers and teachers that attempt to facilitate a sense of radical healing in their classrooms and community organizations. And I call it karma with a C, right? Either they use their indigenous culture as an antidote, right? As an antidote to the toxic messages that young people have been exposed to. Talk to Brother George Galvez, Cesar, who uses a deep sense of indigenous identities in his young people, right? A sense of agency. All have a sense of agency, a sense and a capacity to act, to confront, transform, and change the very conditions that shape their lives. So if it's in Tucson, Arizona, in the Ethnic Studies program, that says you have a right to determine what kinds of issues and what kinds of curriculum you can be taught. And young people can organize and have the agency to bring that to bear. Even though they struggled and it didn't win in Arizona, they still have a sense of agency that they can move these things, right? The third is relationships, just like the kind of relationships I built with Phil. How do we sort of move past our professionalism, right? Past our titles. Right? Sometimes people say, what are you, Sean? You're a professor. I'm like, no, I'm a human being, right? Trying to be a good daddy. This is my daughter right there, Naya, right? Right? It's our human capacity, right? It is our humanity that allows us to connect with young people. Relationships, a sense of meaning and purpose, right? What is your life about? Having young people wrestle with that question, man. It's not about getting a job. It's not about just going to school. It's why do you go to school? What is the function of your education? What is the purpose of you being on this earth? That is what we're here to do. Right? Then the last is a sense of achievement, where young people and teachers understand that it's not about just meaning, it's not about all these, but it's also about the capacity for them to see and achieve and understand what that means in their lives. So what does it look like in schools and communities? This is a group of young men I shared with you. There's Phil right there. All of these young men had just come out of probation in Alameda County. They didn't work, and we wanted to understand, could we develop a sense of political consciousness in them and provide a sense of hope in their lives? And so we created something called Radical Healing Circles, where we met every Wednesday night for 2 hours. And in that process, we talked about their lives. We talked about what it is they were struggling with. And the idea is, over the period of a year, we wanted to understand whether or not these conversations and these strategies would actually have an impact. And I could say it was a difficult process. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about it in this workshop. But it's a difficult process. And it was difficult because the issues that they brought to us, we were unaware of. Issues of homelessness. We were just trying to get them jobs, right? But if you don't have an address, you can see the complexity in that. So this was a piece that was written about the program. So the program in Oakland was connected to a program that is also using radical healing as its core strategy. And the idea is that we can't get these young men jobs if they're spiritually hurt, right? If they don't have a sense of hope. And so this program that was written up in the New York Times used this practice, these healing circle practices, both raising their political consciousness about the issues that they face in their lives, but also addressing these issues of trauma through karma. And the idea is that once they brought that together, they're much more better to take advantage of jobs and to place and do better in their lives, right? The next one, and then I'll end here. The question is, if we had radical healing in schools, if we had radical healing in community-based organizations, how can we use technology to actually support that? So we've built an app, right? It's a basic technology that allows us to track real-time how young people are feeling, right? We want to understand when do you feel most powerful, when do you feel most hopeless, and what are the conditions and what are the issues that impact that. And so we're beta testing this technology now because ultimately we want teachers, schools to be able to use this with young people so that we can actually have an understanding of the impact that radical healing has in classrooms and community organizations. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. Cool.
Thankful to be in your presence, and I pray is it working? I switched it on. Is it working for you? Yeah. I'm very thankful to you, Professor Hayes. I'm thankful to Julia, to Krista, Dr. Ginwright for this opportunity. In the 10 minutes that I have, I'm going to fly by what this dream may manifest itself into. Dr. Mindy Foley-Love diagnosis that a lot of young people are facing root shock, completely uprooted from their sense of culture, history, and entire communities have experienced that. And Dr. Valenzuela talks about the notion of subtractive schooling, that the more time that Mexican American kids spend in U.S. schools, their language, their culture, their identity gets subtracted from them. So to hear about indigenous resistance and to hear about indigenous culture is an antithesis to subtractive schooling. So we begin with cultura. We know that cultura cura, that culture heals. And so it's where we start. And we start with our elders teaching those valuable lessons. Young people need to understand that they have mathematics in their blood. And one of our elders who's speaking here tomorrow, Bob Moses, if you get a chance to go here and speak, here's a civil rights leader from SNCC who decided to dedicate his life to focus on African American boys and girls in mathematics because he saw algebra as a gatekeeper. But he understood that we have Mayan and Egyptian mathematics in our blood. And there was a time when we were building pyramids. There was a time when we were designing civilizations, and now we can't pass mathematical standardized tests. Now, as we're developing programs that are what we call cultural care or kinship, it's important that we name it with love. You don't want to name a program Homework Club. It's not inspiring. This is a program in East Oakland, California, where young people were expected to come 4 days a week to do remedial math lessons because they were labeled FBBs, far below basic. But the name they chose was Project Phoenix because they were rising from the ashes. It's important that young people map out hope. So part of the strategy is they needed to learn how to plot on a graph. Why not plot everything that's beautiful about East Oakland? Why not plot everything that's resourceful about East Oakland? And that's taking Dr. Yoso's work of documenting community, cultural wealth, and beginning to look at our community first from our assets and not from what we need and our deficits. In terms of the physical space, oftentimes we know that our schools, Dr. Ginwright talked about this, they have metal detectors. They're dehumanizing spaces. And a lot of young kids carry trauma from murder and from death. And oftentimes they graffiti. They graffiti 4 things. My name because it matters, my neighborhood because it matters and I have pride, rest in peace, and freedom for somebody. And we erase that and we call that vandalism. But we don't call billboards vandalism because they have money to do corporate graffiti. But when a youngster is tagging RIP fill in the blank, they're carrying trauma from someone who's died. And altars aren't just for Day of the Dead, but they can provide a space of healing. Because if you see grandma, every time you walk into that space, even though she's passed, she's still with you. Now, you might have a concrete building that used to look a certain kind of way, but the power of seeing beauty, of seeing Lauryn Hill on the wall, of seeing quotes like, "Don't teach me fake history, trying to hide my ancestry," of just beginning to beautify the space, it does something to the body and to the psyche. Now, we want to develop empowering exposure. What happens when young people see role models that look like them? Rudy Corpus is one of our community heroes in the Bay Area. And Rudy Corpus spent 12 years in San Quentin. When he came out, he started an organization called United Players, first working with the Pinoy and the Southeast Asian community, and now expanding to various communities. And he believes that it takes a thug to save a thug. That's his philosophy. A very different philosophy, with no disrespect, to Teach for America. Teach for America takes certain kind of individuals and brings them to the hood, and he's theorizing that it's the hood that's going to save the hood. I have a feeling that we need both strategies in place, and we need to work together with those strategies. Now, here's another elder, Nane Alejandres, who used to bang and now bangs for freedom. This is a book that was written about his work, where he talks about how healing can be created through our culture. He owns land in the area of Santa Cruz, and he does a lot of work with norteños and sureño former gang members. Now, what happens when you transform and young people transform themselves into teachers? I keep hearing all the time that we have a 9th grader at a 1st grade reading level. Well, guess who they can read to? What happens when a 9th grader reads to 1st graders? They become an instant role model. Saying, what happens when young people, this is our living room, when they're leading Socratic seminars and they don't need us adults to get in the way, but they can have their own discussions. It's powerful when you see that young lady, those two, one with the pink and with the green, reading to young people. And then they begin to understand that literacy matters. This is a history class. This is a Raza history class in our garage, and it's so cold. They're not holding candles in the back because they're being religious. They're holding candles because it's freezing. And it's not East Coast freezing, but you're right, it's cold. It's cold in the winter. And they're learning their history, and there's a makeshift library in the back that they fundraise to create. They are teaching themselves what schools that are practicing subtractive schooling won't do. Now, it's important that we involve familia and comunidad. I want you to come in to one of our family meetings. It's so cold, we had to burn a trash can in the middle of the meeting, but the parents are engaged and they're showing up, but the meeting happens to be at 9 o'clock at night because of a lot of our parents are going through a double shift. And then parents are teaching other parents how to organize, because I thought I heard from the doctor that when you begin to become an activist parent, and an activist young person, you begin to see not the obstacles, but the opportunities for change. Now, it's important that young people learn from their elders. And the Black Panther Party is the reason why we have a free breakfast program throughout the United States. But the young people have a duty to feed themselves and take care of themselves. And it's not pobrecito little kids and they're hungry. No, you're going to wash the dishes. You're going to put in work. You're going to cook. It's a community taking care of itself and providing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Because when you're hungry, it's really hard to learn. Now, with all of this, we've heard this amazing model of karma, and now I'm talking about the culture of care and kinship. Kids don't care how much you know. They want to know how much you care. They want to feel your love, and they want to feel a love that's ride or die. I want to take you to a different direction in the couple minutes I have left, and I want to look at some unconventional wisdom, and I want to find it in gangsters and gangs. I want to talk about 6:01 p.m. It's a very important time in a lot of neighborhoods because that's when all after-school programs are closed. And young people need a sense of protection at 6:01 p.m., and that's usually when there's a lot of gangsters providing that protection that police departments often don't in our neighborhoods. I want to talk to you about rites of passage ceremonies that take place in our neighborhood and that young people in gangs feel a sense of belonging. So we took that mindset, and here's a flyer that young people created to learn their history. And in a matter of 3 hours, they could watch an entire film and have a Socratic seminar about what's happening in their community, and they became scholars in their neighborhoods. And that led to start to organize, to develop clubs, to look at the issues in their community. They're seeing day laborers out on the street, out at Home Depot, and they want to begin to do something about it, and they take on action projects. When young people begin to build peace, these are young men and women from two different neighborhoods. Fremont High School is primarily a Norteño neighborhood, and Castlemont High School is primarily a Border Brother neighborhood. When you begin to teach young people similar history, when you show karma on both sides and you bring them together, also Wednesday nights, we call these homies dinners. It's amazing when kids from different neighborhoods realize, you're not my enemy. We can do this together. And I see no one in the audience that's our enemy. Imagine when this room comes together. I mean, in Oakland, we say it's cookies. It's done. A new world is possible. I can only begin to dream as I look at all of the heaven here on earth that's manifested in you, what we could do united. We're looking at different kinds of circles. You talked about this circle. Circle is such a powerful way to learn and to address trauma. We also look at indigenous ceremonies. So if you look at the eye, this is the eye of the center that I came to Harvard to raise the funds to build in East Oakland. And at the center, we're putting a sweat lodge because it's another way for young people to go through the process of healing through indigenous ceremony. Our theory of action is simply this. If homies youth are socially, emotionally nurtured, if they're meeting their material needs according to Maslow, if they're paired with caring OGs, if they're presented with culturally relevant education, then they will learn, thrive, and self-actualize. And this is what it could look like. Single loan from the government with no operating budget. It was done something called the praxis of hope, the belief that a new world is possible and making it manifest. And so what we're designing now is this is a pretty beat up looking phoenix that's carrying a lot of cumulative trauma. But as we start to put the pieces together, this is the design for the Homies Empowerment Center. And with your help as a community, we can make that a reality. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me turn this on. So hi, I'm Gretchen. I want to have a script, but I'm going to deviate from it because I think it makes more sense to talk like this. So I come to this work from a very different place than both Sean and Cesar, and I don't know actually the extent to which they identify with the communities that they're talking about in terms of their own personal history, but I come from a slightly different personal history in many ways than the community that I'm going to talk about today. So I think in some ways I represent the voice of someone who hopes to be an ally, and there's several ways in which I think about myself as an ally. One is obviously that I'm a white woman. Two is that my socioeconomic status, my sexuality, I'm a lesbian, differ from many of my students. So even though the young people I worked with were from Cambridge, and I grew up in Cambridge and went to the same high school as they did, there are many ways that I was different from them and am different from the young people I continue to work with. And the third and possibly most important one actually these days in my life is that I'm an adult, a parent, and someone who identifies as a teacher, because my history, my personal history is as a middle school teacher. And so I came to the work I was doing with young people through the schools, and that made me very different from a lot of the work that you've heard about earlier. So I want to start by just saying that I represent a very different part of this work, I think. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about work I did as part of my dissertation, and then what I wanted to do actually today was raise a few problems of practice that I've faced as a part of this work for conversation among all three of us, and hopefully audience members, because I'm sure many of you have things to contribute as well. So I was born and raised in Cambridge, went to the Cambridge Public Schools, and have wanted to be a teacher since I was about 4. And I went and started teaching in Baltimore City, and I noticed pretty quickly that we kept talking about the same groups of students as failing, as problematic, as students who needed support. And there were a lot of people who were trying to do good by those young people, but they were the same young people were coming up again and again no matter what we did. So I became more and more interested in what was it that the young people in my class needed to actually feel and be successful in school and to feel supported as whole people. One of the things that I became most interested in was student support systems in school. And the reason, there's a couple reasons for this, but one of them is that historically, students have received support when they need help with academic issues through the special education services. And of course, there's a lot of issues with how we label students as special education that I'm not going to go into. But one interesting thing about special education is that it gives students the right to have a voice, and it gives their parents to have the right to have a voice in the services that they receive after they're 14. So parents are always given a voice, and after they're 14, students are supposed to have the right to have a voice. Today, there are many young people who are failing in schools who don't qualify for special education services, who are getting supports through something that is typically referred to as student support. And the way that works is that adults in a school building come together, typically without any parents and without any young people, talk about what the young people need, make decisions about what they need, and then give them those things. And then we think that those things aren't working, and we wonder why. And so I wanted to understand how the young people themselves were thinking about the kind of supports that they were being given. So I decided to engage in that process by partnering with a group of young people in a youth participatory action research project. Actually, I don't like to refer to it as YPAR. I like to refer to it as collective research with young people, because in YPAR, for those of you who know a lot about YPAR, really the young people should have agency over the research question itself. And I came to this project with a question. So I was collaborating with them, but I don't like to call it YPAR because I don't think they had the extent of the agency that they should have had. I was able to hire a group of 15 young people from Cambridge to work with me over the summer. So they were working with me through part of a youth employment program, which meant that all of them wanted a job and had signed up to be a part of this youth employment program, but only one of them actually wanted a job as a researcher. Most of them wanted a job to doing other things, and they got stuck in my research program. It felt a little like school at the beginning, and that was a struggle, but together over the course of a summer, we designed a study, piloted some protocols, recruited participants, and analyzed data around how other young people in our city, and it was my city too, were thinking about accessing and rejecting support. And I don't want to go into the findings of that study here because I'd rather use my time to think about the broader questions, but there are two things I want to say that I think really connect to what Sean and Cesar led with that came out of this for me. One, and these are actually not even the findings, these are ways that my own thinking was changed by the work with the young people. So the first one is that I moved from believing, the teacher, me, believing that young people weren't accessing supports because they either didn't know they existed or didn't have enough access to them, to believing that young people had very clear, well thought out, conscientious ideas about what support was, and we weren't actually providing them with things that met or fit with those ideas. So the match between what we as adults were providing them and what they wanted wasn't there in many cases. And therefore, in the same way that people have talked about young people dropping out of school as an act of resistance instead of an act of deviance, in many ways young people were rejecting the supports we were offering them as an act of resistance because the type of support they were calling for wasn't being offered. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I don't want to focus on the findings. The second thing that I learned is that the ways in which we set up support systems in school, and I think this really fits with this notion of radical healing and soul rebels, is all wrong for many young people. We set up supports based on professional role, right? If you need a tutor, if you have academic trouble, you need a tutor. If you have social emotional issues, you go to your counselor, right? If you have issues with your family, you go to a family therapist. Young people that I speak to often seek support based on relationship. And that means that they may go to the same person for support with all those different domains, and that's in fact significantly more effective than the supports we've been suggesting. And it also means that that person may be a young person. It may not be an adult. So my own thinking has really been pushed in terms of thinking about supports in schools. So I now want to raise a few tensions that in the work that existed for me. And I'm going to speak about them fairly briefly because I think it'll be more fun to talk as a group. The first is the tension of identity. And I started to talk about this a little at the beginning. Even though I was raised in Cambridge, my identity is very different than the young people with whom I worked. And so as we collaborated, there were a lot of moments when I had to check myself in terms of my own identity and the ways in which that was influencing my interpretations of the work and them. And a really clear example of this for me is around my identity as a teacher, right? My identity as a teacher meant that I thought that as their boss, there were certain things I needed to do. They should come on time. I was paying them. I needed to make sure that they acted in certain ways. And I had to really push myself to think differently about my relationship to these young people if I wanted to, in fact, allow their identities to shape the way in which we were interpreting the data and building power together. So that's one sort of problem of practice I think that we could talk about, is how our personal identities as allies or as adults who collaborate with young people influence the work that we're doing and how we think about that. The second big issue is power. And for me, this is very connected to identity because there are many parts of my identity that position me as a person of privilege. But power also relates to co-constructing knowledge in my case. So a really concrete example of this was that partway through the, and actually this has to do with identity too, partway through the summer, one of the young people really wanted to drop out of my program. She wanted to switch work sites. And there was a rule that she couldn't do that. But more importantly than the rule, I really didn't want her to do that because she was one of the strongest, wisest voices on our team, and she had the most to say back to her community. But she was very clear about the reasons why she wanted to do this. And I had to make a decision about whether I was going to relinquish my power as an adult in that context and let her have agency over what she wanted to do, even though maybe a piece of me, based on my own identity and experiences, thought that she would benefit from not doing it. And in the end, I let her quit because it felt important to me to give her that power. It definitely negatively impacted our team. And then the last one, which I think also relates to power and identity, is epistemology. And I apologize because I know that's a Harvard-y word, or theory of change. But that is how we think about what it means to create knowledge is very much can be very much challenged by young people when we begin to do work with them. And so the most concrete example I have of this, and it's a conversation I've probably had with some of you actually, is around the question of critical theory and critical consciousness. I came to the project I was doing because I wanted to support the development of critical consciousness among these young people around what was happening in their community around support. And I came with my own narrative around the fact that support was being constructed in a way that had to do with this history of trauma that is being talked about. not all of the young people in my project saw this issue of support in a critical way. There were many of them who were more prone to repeat narratives that were coming out of society at large about the need for people to have individual success. It's sort of what I call an up by my bootstraps narrative, but around the American dream. And I really struggled with the extent to which I should teach what I wanted young people to learn versus let that grow organically, and what would happen if I did not teach because I didn't want to use my power, but then part of what we did was reproduce some dominant narratives around power. So those are three sort of challenges that I face that I hope we can take up if they're of interest to people later on. Thanks.
I'll ask Krista to make some comments and raise some questions, and then we'll move into discussion.
So one of the most important things for me at this phase in my life is to recognize that I am a novice at what I am doing. This is actually the first time I've ever been a discussant, and I'm a little worried about, like, how do you follow these incredible voices and these amazing stories and contribute in some way, and particularly in this case because these individuals, Helen has been an incredible mentor to me here at Harvard. Sean's work has been incredibly influential in my own thinking and the development of some of the research that I'm doing. Gretchen and I used to be students together in the same lab, and now she's a professor, and I work for her, and she's really helped shape so much of my thinking about development. And of course, Cesar and I are students together, and that has a meaning that only graduate students can share, right? And so this is an incredible group of people who have been very inspirational to me as a student and in my profession as well. And I come to this having had two distinctly different roles, because I spent 10 years as a community organizer where my job was to say to people in community, how do I ensure that you have the tools you need to be successful at the work that you care about? And then I went to work at the Washington State Senate during the recession, where my job was to do things like write bills that, eliminated welfare for half the kids that were receiving public assistance. So those two roles are very difficult to reconcile with each other, and they're both incredibly relevant to the challenges that we face. And so from that perspective that I bring, and having listened to these amazing stories that we've heard, I really feel that there are three themes to sort of pull out from them. The first is this question of what are the roots of efficacy? Efficacy is my belief that what I do is going to impact what happens next in my life. And it's incredibly important, and I think Sean spoke so beautifully to this with his use of the word hope. Individuals who don't have a sense of efficacy face very deep challenges, right? And so we've heard today that some of the roots of efficacy are questions of who am I, right? Who am I? What is it that I have to give? Who are my people? And what do we as a people want? And I think that across all of our speakers, we heard very strongly that nurturing those roots of efficacy is a critically important thing to do. And as the discussion unfolds, we could talk somewhat about how we might be able to do that in public policy, because I have some opinions about that. The second thing that came to me that I think is very important is the role of creativity. Like, each of these scholars told us a story of a very creative enterprise, a creative way of looking at what is the problem here, what is the solution here, who are the allies here, who are the stakeholders here. They brought creativity to each of those components. And I would suggest that we really cannot move forward in making big changes in the world at either the community or the policy level until we learn to embrace our creativity with much greater vision and strength. And the third thing is that I come to all things as a systems thinker. And I loved the plants. I love the plants so much. Because systems thinking is a way of looking at solving complex problems that draws from ecological science rather than more sort of mechanical physics, right? Looking to how biosystems have balance, how do forests keep themselves healthy, how do plants detoxify themselves when they are together in a single bubbled-in space. And one of the most important things that I have ever learned, well, I'm going to tell you the two most important things I have learned in my journey in systems thinking. The first, I learned from Margaret Wheatley, whose book Leadership in the New Science, if you haven't read, you must read. And Meg used to say to me, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is efficiency. And I think that goes to many of the sort of challenges that Gretchen raised and many of the challenges that we feel in schools. Like, do you efficiently train to the test? Or do you teach kids the truth about where they come from, right? So the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is efficiency. And the second most important lesson that I learned from systems thinking is you should always pay attention to ancient wisdom. You should always pay attention to ancient wisdom. And we can go back in almost every spiritual system that we know, in almost every civilization that we know, and we can point to a great voice from that place that reminded us, you know, no person is an island, right? Humans are social animals. You must be connected to the vine. Nearly every ancient culture has taught us that you must be in community. Humans die when we expect them to be pathologically individualistic and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So for me, one of the most wonderful things that I hear is this idea of how do we fundamentally come together so that we can address all of our young people as whole people in community where they're connected with others. So those are a few of the themes that I've pulled out. I think I'm supposed to ask some questions, so I will just leave my favorite question on the table. I'm not sure how well connected it is to what folks here had to say. But I came to Harvard at age 48, which is a crazy thing to do. I promise you, it's a crazy thing to do. Because of my experiences at the Senate, because of those early slides that Sean put up about the 4 Ps, right? And I began to really wonder about this question of what do we need to do to radically reduce the need for social services across the lifespan and between generations. And so I've been asking the questions lately, what would it look like if our schools were actually subdivisions of public health, where their core responsibility was to support the positive and optimal development of the whole young person?
Now we have panel discussion. If you'd like a panel to come up here, I'll sit in the middle so I can then take authority, which I don't want to do, but you know, lovingly facilitate.
You go ahead.
You got it really clear.
I like that question. I love it.
A lot of comments, some questions, wonderful questions from Krista, wonderful questions from each of the participants. Who'd like to start? Make comments and respond to anything that's been said. Don't all speak at once.
We're only speaking.
Just you. Just this.
Okay.
This is a teeny chat show. Yes. You'll just join us later. Yes. Yes.
Well, I want to respond to the last question. What if, I think it was a what if question. What if we made schools principal responsibility, public health centers? So I think that that's a really interesting idea. And for a couple of reasons. I think and I'm going to take some risk here because we're in the School of Education, that much of what we do as educators, we learn a discipline and we learn to think in certain ways that actually prohibits us from coming up with a bold enough solution to confront, change, transform the problems that we want to solve. And so we get immersed in a certain way of thinking that in some ways just restricts us. So just as an example, I'm giving my class in San Francisco State a midterm right now, and I said, based on the problem, I want you to come up with a solution only using your imagination. You have $40 million to do it, and it's the hardest thing that they've ever had to do. And my point is that if we refuse to engage our imaginations, and this is why I think that the idea you said was so important, if we refuse to engage our imaginations in such a way that we're not going to come up with the kind of solutions, because the issues that we're facing in these neighborhoods and schools far outweigh our capacity to outthink them, right? And I think the answers are going to come from our imagination. So I think that's a great and interesting idea.
So I have a sort of follow-up question. I don't know if this, because I agree with that, and I also find more and more that that raises a question for me around people like those of us in this room making active decisions not to work from within the system and to work without. And one thing that strikes me about all the programs that you both presented, because I think there were more than two, really, is that they're without, right? And more I meet students who are telling me, like, I don't want to get the license because the license is going to prevent me from doing the work the way I need to do it, which I think is in part about imagination and in part about relationships. And I myself had this realization when I was talking to young people around mandated reporting, because confidentiality was a huge reason young people were opting out of using supports, and I totally get that. And yet, you know, there is this challenge around mandated reporting. So my question is, as two people, and Krista, feel free to answer this, so three people who, I mean, we're in an institution, right? It's not like we are all standing out there doing the work on the street, although you are both also doing the work. Like, how do we balance those two things for ourselves, and then how do we suggest that people out here think about those issues as people who are potentially in institutions too?
Yes, I should answer this.
I don't know if I can do justice to try to answer that, but
I'm sure.
I'm gonna take a departure and say that, is it possible to consider that we have a social service industrial complex? Is it possible to consider that it's another form of addiction? Could social services be bad for people? And I want you to, before you dismiss it, to just consider it for a while. That what is the difference between community service and community empowerment? And so, also, those of us that come from the nonprofit sector, is there a nonprofit industrial complex that is directly connected to the government and government funding? And what would autonomous, independent, sovereign centers and even schools, shall I say, look like? And so I'm not big on conspiracy theories, and I'm not asking you to go down that line, and I don't think it's an either or. I don't. But I'm just asking us to consider, because we hear a lot of talk about Harlem Children's Zone and about the place that has everything you could ever want. And I'm wondering, and this is not about Harlem Children's Zone, I'm wondering when we create dependency and when we create independence. And you brought up a powerful point that you came to Cambridge with a narrative thinking this trauma is going to manifest itself, and listening with the great ear that you did, the community in the form of the young people were saying something different. And oftentimes, some of the challenges that I have in this institution is that I meet very brilliant people who have the brand new idea that will save the world. And I'm wondering what part of, is there a savior's complex? Is there a way of looking at what's happening and doing very little diagnosis about the impact that social services has done on communities? Not to empower, but to probably, excuse me for saying it, cripple a community. But I am not advocating for a complete removal. But I'm wondering if we're creating addiction, because if we can have your social security number, if we can have control about where you live, if we can have you coming to us for the solutions, if we are the ones that fish the fish and you're coming to get the fish from us in the form of healthcare, in the form of clothing, in the form of food, and we have the knowledge and we have the schools of education, I'm wondering if we continue what I like to call mental slavery.
So,
This is provocative, Cesar. Yes. Krista.
so I would like to respond to that, and I think it's it's one of the most important questions. And I'm gonna be bold, and I'm gonna tell you the story that is like the most shameful story of my life, which is that I went to work at the Senate. As my job was I was the policy advisor on human services and corrections for the Senate Democrats, who were the majority party at the time. So basically, their decisions were the decisions. And it was at the beginning of the recession, and Washington State has only sales tax. We could talk for a long time about that. It's a constitutional thing. And what that means is that in a recession, when people stop buying stuff, that state loses revenue faster than any other state would, because purchasing decreases faster than unemployment increases. And it's also the place where recovery of revenues is the slowest. So the state of Washington, over the course of the recession, lost 40% of its revenue. And due to the constitutional structures around the funding of K-20 education, that meant virtually all of those cuts had to come from human services. So like as a practical matter, what that means is that when I started in 2009, the human services budget was $18 billion, and it's now down to $10 billion. So like that is an enormous magnitude of cuts. And the people who lost services in the course of that were, for example, all the children who exist between 33% of the federal poverty line and the kids who live at 62% of federal poverty line. They all lost their public assistance benefits. And my takeaway from that, Cesar, was that America does not have the political will to fund a safety net that is good for kids, that's developmentally appropriate, that is mentally healthy, that meets even the most basic needs of the poorest children, and we don't even talk like from a policy perspective about their parents, unless we're talking about fraud and other crazy things. And so my takeaway was that we're not going to do that. Like, America does not have the political will, and America will not have the political will in my lifetime. And so that meant that I had to think about, like, what is a radical alternative to that. And so my own personal decision was to leave that system and to spend some time incubating and thinking about, are there ways in which schools could, over the course of 1 to maybe 3 generations, radically reduce the need for social services by doing things better. So for example, I would argue that like suspension from school contributes incredibly to entry into various social service systems and into prison. So are there things that we could do better at the classroom level that lead to suspension? Are there things that we're not doing that we could do better? Right? Like, for example, why can't schools serve as a designated payee for children whose parents are not eligible to receive public assistance, as an example? And then the third thing is, are there wholly new roles that schools could take on that would be driven by community need and community decision-making and community participation? And that together those things could make a huge difference. And at the same time that I've done that thinking, I also feel like Sean's message on people in the community, and your message as well, Cesar, people in community organizing themselves around what's important and efficacious and needed here in this place by us. It has to be that both and.
So I think it's a great question around what constitutes liberation, and how can our systems either inhibit or promote that. So let me give you an example of, I think that on one hand, we need to understand what constitutes sovereignty and a separation from the nonprofit industrial complex and all those sorts of ways of thinking about organizations. But on the other hand, those are my tax dollars that I have a right and sovereignty to determine how they should be spent in my community. So I think it's an interesting tension. Let me give you a concrete example. Alameda County, the county that I work and live and study in, receives probably about $80 million just in mental health services alone. That's distributed into schools, community health clinics, and schools, community health clinics, and some hospitals, right? About $80 million to bring mental health. Most of that actually does not meet the mental health needs of people like Phil. So the question then is, if we continue to think about the systems, social service systems, as existing in these forms, right? That is, we hire counselors and we send them into schools and they give the service and there's an exchange and the kids get better, right? That actually doesn't work. And so one of the things I've been pushing our city council and folks on is our young people, we need to go where they are and where they actually seek mental health. And that's because we've only been thinking about mental health in these really small sort of institutional practices. So I said, well, where do young people go? Well, they are in barber shops. What if we train barbers to have conversations with young people about their mental health status? What if we train them to actually provide, use barbershops as mental health centers? It means that we shift where we're so stuck into thinking about conventional ways about how we deliver the service, and we're not using what young people do well already. And if we use an asset-based approach, then we can begin to expand and rupture that normalcy that that continues to reproduce the kinds of outcomes that we want to see. I don't know if they're going to shift, but there's some good examples of systems that are transforming how we think about systems and that are meeting the needs of young people.
I think that's a very important point. I'm hearing is that there's a certain tension in all of your conversations about whether we really need to either remove the system or drastically change it in the way that perhaps says I was talking, or whether we want to reform the system. And I think some of you are also saying, actually, it's not necessarily the system as such, it's how it's used. And we're not even looking realistically at what's really going on. Your example of the barbershop that could be a therapy center, as it were, and seeing actually how people engage in communities, looking at communities as dynamic and vibrant systems, and how they really work, rather than looking at the conventional boundaries we put on school, social centre, services centre, hospital. We actually look at how they work, get away from the kind of 19th century model of what the institution is doing, and see what it's actually doing. It's not so much about changing the institutional structure as recognising what the institutional structure is and working with it. That seems to be what I'm hearing.
I think that that's true, but I also feel like what I hear in the work, and you all should correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is something in the history of our institutions in this country in particular that is the antithesis, that is dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
that
yes.
we need to figure out if we're going to use the institutions that currently exist in these new ways, which is great and cool in a lot of ways, we also need to figure out how we are going to change the culture of those institutions such that they are not dehumanizing and disenfranchising.
And all I would add to that, and it's really brief, is that when you diagnose someone, when psychologists diagnose somebody, we need to find a disorder. And we look at the people that we serve in social service agencies as clients, as patients. Frantz Fanon would argue that psychology is another tool of imperialism. And so it's something to consider. Are we colonizing through social service? Because we need numbers. The more broken kids there are in neighborhoods, the more jobs we have. And so I'm going to tell a quick, I thought I was going to be quick, but I got to say this.
That's okay.
Quick. I just got to say this. There's a Stop the Violence movement in Oakland, California that's a fallacy. No one really wants to stop violence in Oakland because it's coroner's overtime pay. It offers the cemetery a lot of resources. It offers the funeral home a lot of resources. It offers the rosary shop, the t-shirt shop. It offers cops, sheriffs overtime pay. It allows their kids to go to college. And it allows for manufacturing companies like Smith & Wesson to proliferate guns, and for major drug empires to continue to spread. So there's a lot of money to be made off of violence. And then it creates jobs. So there's a violence reporter or a crime reporter for the Oakland Tribune, for the San Francisco Chronic, not Chronicle, but for ABC News. I mean, these are real jobs that the more violence there is, the more resources there are, and the more jobs there are in the social service industrial complex. Something to really consider. Do we really want to stop the violence, or do we benefit from mass violence and from perpetuating trauma?
Thank you, Cesar. At which point I think we should open it now to the audience, who I'm sure are dying to say something. So who would like to start from the audience interacting on this? At the back. Matt. Just Matt, isn't it?
So I'm going to speak loud.
Actually,
Do you want me to have one?
can someone act as runner? No, sit here, because you'll need to answer. Can somebody act as runner? Thank you. Take it up to Cesar.
All right. So y'all can hear me, right? Okay. So what I'm hearing from the panel discussion is a move toward deinstitutionalizing America, based on the idea that there's a collective investment in, quote, poverty and disorder, which I generally agree with. I'm a lawyer. I'm pretty certain that I wouldn't have had a job for a few years if there weren't crimes and the like going on. And they paid me. So how far does this go? Because, I mean, there has to be some sort of limit. I mean, it could be infinite in one direction, and you end up with a complete dismantling of our institutions, including this one, which serves to produce teachers and administrators in a certain mold to go back into schools and to communities to perpetuate what they've learned here. Or we could always go in the exact opposite direction and try to take over the system using the same tactics, which is inculcating minds and sending people out with the hopes that our system is better than the one that it's replacing. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly should be done, because it's a classic dilemma in one sense, but one whose very existence depends upon the institutions that we're claiming to be the fifth column to subvert.
I think let's take a few questions. Who would like to take another one? Who'd like to say thank you, Matt? Who has a yes, over here someone has a oh, we got it.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your voices and the amazing work that you're doing. So we've talked a lot about the struggles that African American and Latino youth are facing and the radical healing that needs to happen. But what about Asian youth, specifically in the Bay Area with a large Cambodian community? You know, Cambodian youth also have this strong historical trauma, this environmental trauma, the cumulative trauma, and they need this healing as well. They need this radical healing. So what are the resources out there for them, and why are they always lost in this conversation?
I think we'll take that answer to that, because it's a specific question. Yes, do you want to answer that?
Well, just quickly, so you're right. First of all, and then it's a reflection of my own work in African American communities. The new book that I'm writing about is highlighting Rudy Corpus's work in San Francisco, who does work with Filipino and Asian young people as well. So you're exactly right. But I think my intent is to not sort of show that this is only African American issue, but many young people of color in low-income communities experience the same thing. So United Players, do you know Rudy? Okay. So.
Cesar just talked about
Yeah.
And all I would add is that there's something to be said for Dr. Lowen's work. Dr. Lowen wrote a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And there's something called the model minority myth. And I thought I heard Dr. Ginwright talk about the power of social activism. And many Asian American communities have been very active. One in particular, Chinese American community and the Iwar Kuen, Clenched Fist, which is another form of a Black Panther Party that no one ever hears about in the civil rights movement. And when you label someone a model minority, it's a way to silence activism, that there was resistance when people got here. And so I think it's important that we just celebrated in Cambridge Columbus Day. That's how backwards we are in 2014. We're celebrating someone that supposedly discovered us. And so there's an invisibility for Asian Americans, and when we hear model minority, it hides Southeast Asian, the Hmong community, the Pinoy community, and so many other communities but I don't want to position the Cambodian community as just a suffering community. There's a lot of resiliency, a lot of revolutionaries, and a lot of agency. And so I don't want to talk about the Asian community as, let's notice that they're struggling too, but let's also notice that they're resilient, and let's learn from that resilience as well, so that we don't paint a narrative of just need, and we forget the asset-based Cambodian community.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. Cesar especially, sorry. But no, we're in the same program, friends. So I guess my question kind of builds on Matt's question, which is knowing some about homies empowerment and knowing and hearing about your work, Dr. Ginwright. My question is, when we know that a large number of students are within this system that we're suggesting to sort of dismantle in a certain kind of way, not to say that communities don't have assets, but the scale and reach of the types of programs, particularly if they're not going to go for funding and going to be kind of separate, potentially there's a limit in scale or reach. So as we're suggesting to dismantle the system, what is the response to the fact that we have to reach all the kids who are currently being reached by schools? In a negative way, I think a lot of people can agree, but there are a lot of students being reached, and potentially if we were to use the power that's been pointed out a couple of times in this room with a different lens or a different slant, we could reach those students with some of these strategies like the karma and different things that are being suggested.
So I never said we should dismantle the system, right? So I don't want to mischaracterize the importance of the existing systems that we have, though dysfunctional they might be, right? And so I think what Gretchen had suggested is that on one hand, we do need to figure out profound and powerful ways to humanize the existing systems where our young people are, period, the end, right? And that begins here in graduate schools, right? Which is, how are you being humanized, right? How is your humanity showing up in these classes? How are your own issues influence how you see the possibilities of these systems? So that's one thing, right? But I also live in, part of this comes from my exposure to innovation in the San Francisco Bay Area. The other strategy is, how much do we invest in unconventional, innovative strategies that are outside of those systems, right? We haven't done enough of that, right? And there's this culture in the Bay Area where people start up startups and they fail. And people go, yay, we know that doesn't work anymore, right? And they learn. I don't think we have a culture of innovation, a culture of trying stuff that has never been done before. I don't think we have enough of that in the way in which we've been thinking about doing education. So I think we need, one, a humanizing of the institutions, and we need to invest profoundly in innovative strategies and practices and create something that we don't know that exists yet. So I think we need both of those things simultaneously.
This person has their hand up. Judy, can you pass it to me?
Can I say one thing while you're I really agree with that, and I am really working on what it means to be an adult that's listening to the way young people are innovating, which I think you all both are doing well, and bringing and not just bringing their voices, actually like having them do the innovating and giving up the power, but connecting them to resources. Because I think the other thing we do as a culture is we just completely sort of reject the notion that young people have knowledge that we haven't given them.
Yeah,
So Nelson Mandela once said about education, it's the greatest weapon that can be used to change the world. And implicit in that statement is that education is a weapon, right? And in this country, we've seen education be used as a weapon for negativity in many ways. Looking at boarding schools, for example, with Native Americans, which were used to assimilate and basically eradicate an entire culture. And Martin Luther King Jr., before he died, in speaking of education, said that he felt that African Americans were assimilating into a burning house, right? And we've talked so much about reforming the institutions themselves, but do you think, speaking specifically with education, where you have diversity issues taken out of the curriculum and more testing and more standardization, do you think we're going to need eventually to completely provide education from outside the institutions? For example, let's say a community in South Florida, where I'm from, providing alternative schools where African Americans take control of those schools, take control over the curriculum, take control over the resources, and try to move away from the public model, because oftentimes these institutions are very tough to reform. And there's a lot of forces holding on to a history of racism. And I don't think it's always as explicit, but for example, when we don't teach African American history, so I'm not talking about African American in this country, but African American history, like Africa, in our schools, we're denying kids the right to learn about their cultural heritage. Are we going to need to completely move away from the institutions themselves?
Thank you. Okay, I think that's a very good question to sort of finish on. So, like, all members of the panel to respond to that. This is in fact an overarching question, and I think then we'll go to a close. Okay, Gretchen, do you want to take?
Oh, geez. I think there's a place for that. I think there is a place for communities reclaiming their space outside of institutions. And there is certainly a place for people to say we are going to reclaim schools. And I think there are communities that have and will do that, and that's powerful. My fear around that is that that leaves a lot of institutions with young people in them and us not talking about those institutions. And so I think it's a balancing act in terms of figuring out how to create third spaces where we can try out these new things and figure out and innovate in ways that are really empowering to communities, and also not forgetting that that does not release us from the requirement that we also work to reform the institutions that are raising young people.
Krista.
That is a very difficult question. I think I agree with what Gretchen says. I think we have a both-and situation, and I also think that we have a moral obligation to notice and ally ourselves with the courage of others. So, as an example, you may have noticed in the news that the state of Washington was the first state to lose its Race to the Top waiver. That was actually an active political decision that was made within the context of the legislature. And that decision was made because there's been an ongoing conversation across the state for about the last 10 years around trauma and around the effects of trauma on learning. And so there's a very good vocabulary both at the community level and at the legislative level about the ways in which having experienced a great deal of trauma and testing don't go together. So I would say, like, if you looked at the work of Sampson's work on exposure to community violence and its impact on test scores, I think he says up to 50% of the achievement gap can be explained by exposure to violence in the community. So it was that community level knowledge in Washington that led to creating this groundswell of political will that said we are going to reject the component of Race to the Top that says that we're going to evaluate teachers based on test scores because there's so much more going on. And so I think the challenge for all of us here is to stand with that courage. That is an amazingly courageous act for a legislature to let go of that much money in the midst of what is an enormous financial crisis because they understand what's really at stake for young people. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is also think about where are we going to stand with people of courage.
Cesar.
I think that it's possible to have a split screen strategy. I think that it's possible to still, I have systems thinking in me, and I don't mean the amazing systems analysis that Krista has. I am a byproduct of this system. And so part of my limited thinking is I don't think a new world is possible. I am afraid of leaving Pharaoh. Moses asked Pharaoh to let my people go. I'm afraid to let the system go because of the fear of the unknown. And it has scaled so much, and I'm wondering about 8 million people in probation or incarceration. I'm wondering about 3 million dropouts a year. I'm wondering about 8 million homeless. That is some data points that have been produced. I'm wondering about the 13th Amendment of the Constitution that abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime. And everyone seems to be angry at the prison industrial complex, and they follow the line of thinking with the new Jim Crow, but they don't understand that the same system that funds prisons funds schools. And so I'm wondering what the connections are, and at what point I'll let the system go and dream of a new world and use creativity and hope and courage and fear, and just in this lifetime stand for something that could be freedom, that could be the praxis of freedom. And I'm wondering why at Hugsy we don't have a Bell Hooks type of education, why we don't have an Audre Lorde type of education, why don't we have a Gloria Anzaldúa type of education, why don't we don't have a Paulo Freire type of education? Because if I got other ideas in my head, I just might change the world.
Thank you, Cesar.
Done.
Sean.
Done. Done, baby. Say anything.
Sean.
All I have to say is I think we need to really wrestle with what constitutes public. I think that in education we have a very narrow vision and imagination about what constitutes public. And I think we haven't had a robust debate about that. And I think in graduate schools like this, that people need to push the envelope around what constitutes public. I don't think we've imagined the kind of systems that we need yet.
Right.
Right? And it is only in these kind of spaces that we can do that. And I think that that kind of public debate about how dollars are spent, we haven't had enough debate about that. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be figuring out.
Well, thank you, Sean. I think I'm hearing that it's our obligation as a school of education to really ask some very deep questions and very profound questions, and not stick band-aids on the system and actually look at how the system is working, and then consider perhaps ways that Cesar would like us to move forward, and others as well. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for our guests coming all the way from San Francisco, and thank you for our locals who have done a fantastic job. So thank you, and thank you all of you.
Cesar. It's great, bro. It's good, bro.
Oh, man, you made me cry.
Man, that's good, bro.
That's fuel to the fire.
Oh, yes, yes. All right. I